His name was Ferdinand Magellan. He was born in Portugal and served at the royal court. But when his homeland turned its back on him, he refused to surrender. Instead, he went to the King of Spain with an audacious proposal: to reach the east by sailing west. What drove a Portuguese nobleman to switch his allegiance to Spain? How did he convince a king to fund a voyage into the absolute unknown? Why did a mutiny erupt almost immediately? Where did he find the strait that would forever redraw the map of the world? And why did Magellan himself not live to see his triumph? This video tells the full story of the world's first circumnavigation. We'll recount how ships and crews were lost, how sailors drifted in the vast silence of the Pacific, and how a single battered ship finally made it home, achieving the impossible. A Portuguese youth at court. Ferdinand Magellan was born around 1480 in northern Portugal, in the small village of Sabrosa among vineyards, olive groves, and narrow stone roads. His family belonged to the minor nobility, honorable enough to be considered people of status, but not wealthy enough to provide a carefree life for their children. His father, Rodrigo de Magalhães, served as the king's local representative, overseeing tax collection and law and order. His mother, Aldade de Mesquita, came from a respected local family, and through her connections, young Ferdinand received a proper education. He learned to read and write, studied arithmetic, catechism, and Latin prayers. But his childhood wasn't confined to books. He accompanied his father on administrative duties, joined hunts, and listened to the tales of merchants and soldiers passing through, stories of distant lands rich with spices and gold, of people with different skin and different gods. These stories captured his imagination and forged a deep thirst for adventure. At around 12, he was sent to the court of Queen Leonor, widow of King John II, in Lisbon. There, the young Magalhães began his service as a page. This was a crucial test. He left his rural home for the strict rules and refined manners of the courtly elite, where politics and naval expeditions were constant topics of discussion. At court, he continued his education in fencing, horsemanship, geography, astronomy, navigation, and cartography, sciences vital to Portugal during the Age of Discovery. Lisbon lived and breathed the sea. The harbor was full of sails, the markets overflowed with spices and silks, and the court buzzed with talk of overseas possessions. Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama had reached India, and King Manuel I dreamed of Portugal becoming the master of the Indian Ocean. Though not from the influential high nobility, the young page absorbed everything about navigation, showing by all accounts remarkable diligence and attention to detail. Upon reaching 25, Magellan entered military and naval service. He joined the fleet of Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. This armada was meticulously prepared to not only protect the crown's interests, but to establish a permanent military presence in the region. The fleet crossed the Atlantic, rounded Africa, passed Mozambique and Zanzibar, and finally reached the west coast of India. Here, Magellan faced his true trials. He fought in skirmishes against Moorish ships, escorted trade convoys along the Malabar coast, and guarded trading posts in Cananore and Cochin. With each year he understood more clearly that true power in these territories belonged to those who commanded the seas. Later, in 1510, Magellan returned to India as part of the expedition of Alfonso de Albuquerque, a ruthless strategist who conquered Goa and made it the capital of Portuguese India. The campaign in Malacca was particularly significant. This city, controlling trade routes between China, Java, and India, was a key strategic point.
The assault was brutal. The Portuguese faced fierce resistance, fighting for every house in barricaded streets. During the battle, Magellan was wounded by a spear in the leg, an injury, chroniclers say, plagued him for life, causing a permanent limp. His comrades noted his bravery and coolness under fire. For his role, he was rewarded with slaves, a share of the spoils, and formal commendation, but no promotion. Returning to Portugal a year later, Magellan was a seasoned veteran of 3 Indian expeditions, with combat experience, navigational knowledge, and his own views on colonial policy. Yet at court, his merits were undervalued. His pay was cut, and no new appointments were offered. When he formally requested a promotion and the full reward for his service in Malacca, he was refused. It was then that a deep sense of injustice took root, a feeling that his own country had no use for his efforts.
Falling from grace and flight to Spain. When Magellan returned to Portugal in 1513, he was an experienced officer, yet he found no gratitude, no promotion, only indifference. King Manuel I, while actively expanding Portugal's Asian empire, preferred to give key commands to high-born nobles, not to provincial officers without powerful patrons. The conflict escalated in 1514 when Magellan was wounded during a military campaign in Morocco. Upon his return, he petitioned for a raise due to his injury and had to fight through bureaucracy to get compensation. He was also falsely accused of wrongdoing in a dispute over horse trading. An investigation cleared him of direct guilt, but the mere fact of the inquiry cooled his relations with the court bureaucracy. Magellan tried to defend his name, presenting evidence of his service and his deeds in Malacca, but his voice was weak against his influential rivals. After one final refusal in 1517, he made a decision few dared to consider. He would leave Portugal and offer his services to the Spanish crown, Lisbon's main rival on the high seas. He didn't make a public scene. He simply left the capital that had forgotten him for Seville, where a new chapter of his life would begin. In Seville, he wasn't alone. He was joined by another Portuguese, the scholar and astronomer Rui Falero, a man of difficult temperament but brilliant knowledge of navigation and cosmography. Together they developed an expedition plan they hoped would interest the Castilian court. The plan was this. The Treaty of Tordesillas forbade Spain from sailing east to India, as that zone was allocated to Portugal. But if one could reach the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, by sailing west around the New World and prove they lay in the Spanish sphere, the Spanish monarch could claim a share of the Asian trade without directly violating the agreement. The project was bold, but not fantastical. It required not just a fleet, but precise astronomical calculations and, crucially, the crown's favor. Their first step was an appeal to Juan de Aranda, a powerful official of the Casa de Contratación, House of Trade, which organized maritime expeditions. Aranda listened carefully, saw a chance to outmaneuver Portugal, and agreed to help them present the plan to the young king, Charles I. In early 1518, Magellan traveled to Valladolid. Charles I, though only 18, was already keen on geopolitical opportunities. Magellan spoke calmly and with confidence. He presented a map of the proposed route, explained he knew of a southern passage through the New World, cited rumors of a strait, and assured the king he could lead a Spanish fleet to the Spice Islands without breaking the treaty with Portugal. Charles listened intently. After consulting his advisors, he gave his consent. In March 1518, the Capitulación de Valladolid, an official contract granting Magellan the right to lead an expedition in the name of the Spanish crown,
He was given the title adelantado, a promise of a tenth of all profits from new lands, governing functions, and supreme command. Rui Faleiro was included as the chief navigation advisor. After signing the agreement, Magellan took Spanish citizenship, changed his name to the Castilian Fernando de Magallanes, and settled in Seville to prepare the fleet. He had no ships, no crew, and no funds yet. All that lay ahead. Behind him was the country to which he had given his best years, which had turned its back on him when he needed support most.
The fleet from Seville. The great adventure begins. Returning to Seville with unprecedented authority for a foreigner, Magellan now acted in the name of King Charles I. His mandate was to equip an expedition to the Moluccas by sailing west. Over the next months, he had to assemble a fleet, buy supplies, recruit a crew, obtain astronomical charts, secure funding, and, above all, maintain control over a project viewed with deep suspicion by Spanish officials and captains. Seville was the main port for Castile's transatlantic trade, a hive of constant activity. Here Magellan began his work. The expedition was provided with 5 ships of varying size, condition, and seaworthiness. Trinidad, the flagship, sturdy and well-armed. San Antonio, the largest ship for carrying supplies. Concepcion, a medium vessel, good for maneuvering. Victoria, a sturdy caravel whose destiny would become unique. Santiago, the smallest ship, suitable for scouting coastal waters. They were in poor technical shape, requiring new rigging, hull repairs, sails, and barrels for water, vinegar, and salted goods. Provisions were purchased: salt beef, biscuits, oil, rice, wine, and trade goods like beads, knives, axes, and cloth for bartering with indigenous peoples. Everything had to be accounted for and stowed meticulously. Crew recruitment was difficult. Spanish sailors were reluctant to serve under a foreign commander. Men had to be recruited from all over: Andalusians, Basques, Galicians, Flemings, Italians, and a few exiled Portuguese. Among them were volunteers, convicts seeking pardon, and experienced pilots like the Venetian Antonio Pigafetta, who would become the expedition's chronicler. Also among the crew was one Sebastián Elcano, a Basque merchant captain deep in debt, looking for redemption. His role was minor then, but Magellan noted his experience. The appointed Spanish captains were a source of tension. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio, was a crown-appointed overseer whose arrogant disdain for Magellan was obvious from the start. Gaspar de Concepcion and Luis de Mendoza believed command should belong to a Spaniard. None shared Magellan's vision. Furthermore, Rui Faleiro, initially named co-commander, suffered from bouts of madness and depression and was removed, leaving Magellan as the sole commander. In August 1519, the fleet sailed from Seville down the Guadalquivir River. They waited for almost a month in Sanlúcar de Barramena for final checks and favorable weather. There Magellan held a final council with his captains. His voice held no threats, only firmness. He spoke of duty, the crown's trust, and the value of every sailor's life, but also of the discipline essential for their journey. The reaction was cold. Several officers listened in silent opposition. Finally, on the morning of September 20th, 1519, to the sound of prayers and church bells, watched by crowds on the shore, the 5 ships set sail for the open ocean. Flags of Castile flew from the masts. In the holds were flour, rope, weapons, and water barrels. On board were men whose names were unknown to history. Only one of them knew to what end of the earth he was striving. Across the Atlantic, hardships, Mutiny and Betrayal. When the 5 ships left Sanlúcar, no one on board knew the voyage would take nearly 3 years and result in the first circumnavigation. The first weeks were smooth. The fleet sailed south along Africa and then crossed the Atlantic, reaching South America by November. In early December, they entered a beautiful bay at a river mouth, future Rio de Janeiro, where Magellan allowed a stop. The crews rested, repaired the ships, and replenished supplies. Trade with the local Tupinamba people was lively and peaceful. After Rio, the fleet sailed south. In January 1520, they explored the Rio de la Plata, hoping it was the fabled passage. It was a dead end. Disappointed, Magellan ordered the fleet further south into unknown, harsh latitudes where the coastline grew severe and the weather unstable. By March, the southern autumn arrived. The expedition reached a deep, sheltered bay, Puerto San Julián. Knowing that advancing into worsening storms would mean disaster, Magellan decided to overwinter there. The decision was sound, but unpopular. The cold, idleness, lack of fresh food, and exhaustion fueled irritation. The simmering discontent with Magellan's command began to take organized form. The main conspirators were Captains Juan de Cartagena, San Antonio, Gaspar de Quesada, Concepción, and Luis de Mendoza, Victoria. Cartagena, who had previously challenged Magellan's authority, now acted decisively. The mutineers raised their flag of rebellion. Their ships refused orders. Magellan, left with only the Trinidad and the Santiago, acted with stunning decisiveness. He didn't wait. On the night of April 1–2, loyal officers led a swift raid and recaptured the Victoria, killing Mendoza in the process. This was a turning point. With the Victoria back under control, Magellan used the threat of its guns to retake the other ships. Cartagena and Quesada were arrested. A court-martial was held. Quesada was found guilty of armed rebellion and beheaded on shore. Cartagena, due to his connections, was spared execution, but was marooned on the deserted coast with a priest who had supported the mutiny. Their fate is unknown. After suppressing the mutiny, Magellan restored iron discipline. He reassessed officer loyalty and made the entire crew swear allegiance to him as sole commander. It was a risky but necessary step. Without unity, the expedition had no chance of survival. The trials weren't over. Soon after, the Santiago was sent to scout the coast, wrecked in a storm, though the crew survived and trekked back to camp. The loss was a stark reminder that every mistake in these latitudes could be fatal. Magellan didn't know where the strait was, but when spring arrived, he ordered the fleet to prepare. In late October, the 4 remaining ships weighed anchor and sailed south once more, toward the unknown shore where he hoped the path to the great ocean would open. The Strait of Magellan, a new path revealed. In the southern spring, the 4 ships left San Julián. The southern latitudes still met them with harsh winds, snow, and biting dampness. They sailed along a bleak, seemingly endless cliff-lined coast. Tension grew among the officers. Over a year had passed since leaving Spain. Supplies were dwindling, and the promised strait was nowhere to be found. On October 21, they approached a cape forming a narrow entrance to a bay. A lookout spotted a channel cutting deep inland. Magellan, after a brief council, ordered the fleet to enter. He believed this could be the passage, the connection between the Atlantic and the rumored seas beyond. What seemed a bay soon became a winding, rocky, treacherous strait. Cliffs rose vertically, casting long shadows on the gray water, and willy-waw winds ripped down from the heights, making sail handling perilous. The fleet pressed on, the channel narrowing and widening. They had to stop constantly, send out boats to sound depths, and search for safe passage. It was during this tense exploration that one of the expedition's most crushing blows occurred, the desertion of the San Antonio. While the ship was officially commanded by a loyalist, its pilot, Esteban Gomez, a skilled navigator secretly opposed to Magellan, seized his chance. When the other ships were out of sight, Gomez turned the San Antonio around and fled back into the Atlantic, heading for Spain. On board were most of the expedition's maps, records, and documents. This was not just desertion. It was treason that threatened the fleet's fate and the political support of the entire venture. Magellan learned of the desertion days later, when the San Antonio failed to appear at a rendezvous. He couldn't afford to search. The remaining 3 ships continued through the 373-mile or 600-kilometer-long labyrinthine passage. The transit took 38 days. The men worked to exhaustion, battling unpredictable currents and winds. Exhaustion, scurvy, and despair grew common. Magellan, contrary to legends of his aloofness, was active, inspecting ships, conferring with pilots, and encouraging officers. He knew if the men broke now, all was lost. Finally, in late November, a new sea opened before them. On November 28th, the ships passed the last rocky headland. Ahead was a horizon that was calm, vast, and quiet. No storms, no squalls. The sailors, accustomed to gales and icy ropes, felt a steady wind and calm water for the first time in weeks. It was another ocean. Magellan, standing on the stern of the Trinidad, gazed long at the boundless blue. He named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, not because it was calm by nature, but because after mutiny, shipwreck, and betrayal, the very idea of peace seemed a miracle. None knew that ahead lay not days, as they hoped, but long, agonizing months. But in that moment, the victory was complete. The strait had been found, navigated, and crossed for the first time in history. Ahead lay the great ocean.
The silence of the Pacific, famine and faith. When the 3 remaining ships emerged from the southern strait and turned west, the new, most brutal phase of the voyage began. It was not a battle against an enemy or a storm, but a trial by time, silence, and exhaustion that slowly and mercilessly consumed every ship and every man. At first, it seemed favorable. The new ocean was incredibly calm. No hurricanes, no squalls, no high waves. The wind blew steadily. The sailors, used to the Atlantic's caprices, took the silence as a good omen. They held a west-northwest course, expecting to reach the Spice Islands in a month. But with each passing day, it became terrifyingly obvious. No birds, no clouds, no smells of land, nothing. The sun beat down, heat intensified, the fresh water turned foul, and food supplies dwindled faster than expected. The salt beef rotted in the heat and humidity. The bread was long gone, the flour wormy. Men ate anything that resembled food, dried fish, leftover rice, boiled leather, even sawdust and roasted rat hides, according to chronicler Antonio Pigafetta. Scurvy began its grim work, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, exhaustion, swelling, and death. 2 or 3 bodies, sewn into sailcloth, were committed to the sea each day. On some ships, sailors could no longer perform duties. Officers took their watches, carpenters became helmsmen. And all this in utter silence. No storms, no thunder, no sounds from shore, just the creak of masts, the rare cry of a bird, and the labored breathing of emaciated men. Pigafetta noted they saw no significant land for the entire crossing where they could disembark. Over a month passed, then a second. People lost track of days. Even officers lost all sense of time. Navigators tried to track their course, but dead reckoning errors accumulated. No one knew how far off course they were. Magellan remained stoic. He performed his duties, walked the decks, spoke with the pilots, and held brief councils. He showed no doubt in public, though Pigafetta wrote that even the Captain General's eyes showed traces of exhaustion. He led not by threat, but by example, speaking only to encourage or give a clear order. In early March 1521, after 99 days of unimaginable hardship and over 7,000 miles across the empty Pacific, a sailor on the Concepcion screamed, "Land on the horizon!" It was Guam, one of the Mariana Islands. The landing was immediate. Men rushed to the water, drinking until they collapsed on the sand. They cut down coconuts, dug for roots, and gorged on fruit. In a day, the crew regained more strength than in the previous weeks. Several men died on the beach, their bodies unable to handle the shock of fresh food, but the rest returned to life. The greatest ocean crossing in maritime history was complete. But the most important part was still ahead.
The Spice Islands and a fatal mistake. After the horrific Pacific crossing and a brief stop at Guam, the three ships sailed west, seeking the Moluccas. In mid-March 1521, they approached a large island, Samar, and landed on the deserted shore of a neighboring islet, Homonhon. Here, on March 16, the sailors made a temporary camp to rest the exhausted crew, gather food, and repair the rigging. Here, the first meetings with local people occurred. Outrigger canoes approached the ships at anchor. The islanders carried spears but showed no hostility. Magellan's enslaved Malay interpreter Enrique could understand their language. Through him, it was learned that a respected ruler, Raja Colombo of Limasawa, was nearby and open to trade. Magellan immediately sailed to Limasawa. Raja Colombo welcomed the Europeans warmly. Gifts of cloth and metal goods were exchanged for food, water, and guides. An alliance was formed. On March 31st, the first Catholic Mass on Philippine soil was held on the shore, a powerful symbol for Magellan of a contact made not by the sword, but by word. From Limasawa, the fleet sailed to the populous and politically significant island of Cebu, ruled by Raja Humabon, an influential and pragmatic leader. Magellan knew he needed the local chieftain's support to succeed. He staged a show of force, demonstrating artillery and muskets and gifted weapons and finery. Humabon, impressed by European technology and seeking to strengthen his own position, agreed not only to an alliance, but to conversion. On April 14th, Humabon was baptized as Carlos and his wife as Juana after the Spanish royal couple. Some 800 of their followers were also converted. But this step had consequences. The powerful chief Lapu-Lapu, ruler of the neighboring island of Mactan, refused to submit to Humabon or accept baptism. Humabon asked Magellan to punish his rebellious neighbor. Eager to demonstrate Spanish power and cement his missionary success, Magellan agreed. Against better judgment, he decided to lead the attack himself. Overconfident, he took only 60 armed men from his ships and a few warriors from Cebu, leaving behind his most experienced fighters. He assumed a show of force would be enough. He failed to account for the terrain. On April 27, 1521, the boats could not approach the shore due to shallow water and coral reefs, rendering shipboard cannon support useless. The Spaniards, weighed down with armor, had to wade hundreds of yards to shore, under a barrage of arrows and stones. Lapu-Lapu's forces, which vastly outnumbered the Europeans, used their mobility to flank and surround them. The Cebu allies fled. The Spanish line broke in the waist-deep water. Magellan, covering the retreat, was wounded in the leg. He lost his footing and fell. Surrounded, he was killed by spears and swords. The Spaniards, forced back to their boats, could not recover his body. The man who had navigated a strait and crossed an ocean died not in a storm or from disease, but on a foreign beach, in battle, among people for whom he was a conqueror, not a harbinger of faith. His journey was over, but the voyage was not.
The fleet remained, and one goal remained: to complete the circle.
The return of the Victoria. The circle is closed. Magellan's death at Mactan threw the expedition into deep disarray. They had lost not only their commander, but the sole authority that had united the disparate crew and given the adventure its purpose. The alliance with Humabon quickly unraveled. Suspecting the weakened Europeans, Humabon laid a trap. On May 1, during a feast on shore, his men turned on the guests, killing about 27, including the new captains of the Trinidad and Concepcion. Those still on board barely managed to cut their cables and escape the harbor. The situation was critical. With no leader, few supplies, and no clear plan, the survivors decided they lacked the men to crew 3 ships. They scuttled and burned the Concepcion. The fleet was now down to 2 ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria. Command fell to Juan Sebastián Elcano, the Basque navigator. He was chosen not by title, but by the crew's trust. He proposed a bold plan, not to turn back across the Pacific, but to press on, reach the Moluccas, load spices, and return home by sailing west around Africa. In November, the 2 ships finally reached their original destination, the Spice Islands, specifically Tidor. The local sultan, Al-Mansur, hostile to the Portuguese, welcomed the Spaniards as allies. They spent a month repairing the ships and loading a precious cargo of cloves. When it was time to leave, a fateful decision was made. The Trinidad, leaking badly, would attempt to return east across the Pacific. The Victoria, under Elcano's command, would sail west into the Portuguese-dominated Indian Ocean. The Trinidad was forced back by storms, captured by the Portuguese, and its crew imprisoned. The Victoria, now the expedition's last hope, set sail in December with 47 Europeans and about 13 Asians aboard. Elcano chose a route across the open Indian Ocean to avoid Portuguese ports. The voyage was another ordeal of storms, starvation, and scurvy. They dared not stop anywhere for fear of capture, only making a desperate failed attempt to get supplies in the Portuguese Cape Verde Islands, where 13 men were captured. On September 6, 1522, under the scorching Andalusian sun, a battered, worm-eaten ship with patched sails slowly entered the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. It was the Victoria. Of the 240 men who had set out 3 years earlier, only 18 Europeans and 4 Asians returned. They were met not with fanfare, but with stunned silence. Many had given them up for dead. The ship, whose seams creaked with every wave, carried 26 tons of clothes, a cargo valuable enough to cover the entire expedition's cost. But its most valuable cargo was intangible: the logs, the maps, the knowledge. The world was indeed round, and it could be circled. The journey, begun under the Spanish flag, led by a Portuguese, was completed by a Basque. The exhausted, aged, and silent men who stepped ashore were living proof of the impossible. Magellan's legacy: the price and the glory. The return of the Victoria was not a triumphant parade, but a somber arrival. The survivors were hollow-cheeked, scarred by scurvy, and moved with the slow deliberation of men whose lives had long depended on the wind and a daily ration of water. They were placed under guard for debriefing by officials of the Casa de Contratación. Their stories were recorded, the route mapped. Juan Sebastián Elcano was summoned to Valladolid, where King Charles I granted him a coat of arms featuring a globe with the motto "Primus circumdedistis me." You were the first to circumnavigate me. He received a pension, but, his health broken, died on another expedition just a few years later. Many of the other survivors soon succumbed to the after effects of their ordeal. One who left a lasting legacy was Antonio Pigafetta. His detailed journal, written in Italian and later translated, became one of the most important sources on the Age of Discovery, providing Europeans with their first systematic description of the peoples of the Philippines, the Moluccas, and Oceania. The geographical consequences were profound. The globe, once a matter of theory and conjecture, was now a measurable space. The ocean was no longer an edge, it was a corridor. The voyage proved the East could be reached by sailing west. For Spain, it was a symbolic victory over Portugal. The cargo of cloves on the Victoria alone nearly paid for the entire expedition. More importantly, it revealed a strategic, albeit dangerous, alternative route to the East's riches. The Portuguese, reacting with alarm, intensified patrols and secured papal confirmation of their claim to the Moluccas, leading to further conflict. The greatest change was in worldview. Theory was now proven by action. The map of the world became whole. A path, long, arduous, and deadly, but real, now existed for future explorers, traders, and scientists. Magellan's name, though he did not return, became synonymous with the journey. His death at Mactan, his feud with the Portuguese king, his stubbornness, faith, and ruthlessness merged into the image of a figure whose influence far outlasted his physical presence. The strait he navigated, two nearby galaxies, the Magellanic Clouds, and the very idea of a unified, circumnavigable Earth bear his name. The Magellan expedition was not just an event of its era. It was a point of no return. Before it, the world was fragmented and theoretical. After it, it was connected, measurable, and bound by seas. It was not the end of geographical discovery, but its irrevocable beginning.